Hi, everybody. Welcome to another Chats with Chaudhry. I hope you're safe and well. It's was a cloudy morning this morning in London, but it's now nice and bright. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Thomas Schmidt, who is the Marketing Director, Software and Informatics Division at Agilent Technologies. And today we're going to be talking all about digital labs. So Thomas, good afternoon. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Also a sunny day here in Germany, so
I'm glad to
things
hear
are good.
Yeah, well, it makes such a difference when the sun shines, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Right. Well, look, thank you for taking time out to talk to me today. Obviously, we're going to be talking about digital labs. But before we start talking about those, perhaps you can tell people a little bit about Agilent if people aren't familiar with Agilent, and the digital lab side of your part of the business and your role within that, if you don't mind.
Okay, of course. So what we are trying to do at Agilent is really we want to address the analytical challenges of our customers. And potentially Agilent is mostly known as an instrument vendor, but there is much more, right? Because what we are actually looking at is to provide entire solutions. And this does not only include the instruments, but also the consumables, the services, and of course the software. And this is where I come into the game. Right, so I'm within the Agilent software and informatics division. I'm a marketing director, and I'm responsible for the portfolio strategy, but with special considerations on the workflow aspects.
Fantastic. So let's talk about workflows and in particular digital labs. Can you talk about digital labs? So obviously, digital labs is a subject which has been talked about within life science for a long time, and there's so many conferences out there around smart labs, and that in fact you and I spoke at the Smart Labs conference a few weeks ago. So why are labs not digital yet, given there's been so much talk about it for such a long time?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And so I'm in this business for a long time, and it's really interesting because what digital is today might have been called paperless a long time ago, right?
Sure.
But you're completely right. The problems which are addressed at these talks and what customers want to resolve today are really the same. And we, of course, have to ask ourselves, why is this the case? And I think when we take the perspective of the laboratory, there are internal and external reasons, right? Because I think first we have to understand the operation in a laboratory is very complex. And when the paperless discussions started a long time ago, then of course the vendors thought, okay, we can resolve this. This is in the heydays of what we call lab informatics conversions, where the LIMS vendors added ELNs to their portfolio, where ELN vendors added sample management capabilities to their portfolio, right? And at this point in time, the thought was, okay, if we provide a USP method, then the lab just has to import it and they can go. The problem is that first, the labs are complex, and second, no labs are working in the same way, right? Even within the same company. And so making a lab digital or paperless is not just taking a paper protocol and convert this into a PDF form or a Word document, right? Sure. It's really of applying the business logic and mapping this complexity. This is what really is very difficult. And I think this also goes along with the expectations, right? So it is a significant journey. It is disruptive on the one hand, but I think on the other hand, we as vendors, we also had to learn our lessons.
Right. Well, and also that leads on quite nicely to what, because obviously digital labs means different things to different people. So what do you think digital labs mean?
I think digital lab is almost an overused term, right? So this term seems to be the holy grail for everything. But I think a digital lab is not a goal for a laboratory manager, or should not be a goal for a laboratory manager. It is just a means to an end, right? Because what we ultimately want to achieve is an error-free lab and the most efficient lab we can get to. And of course, there are paradigms of a digital lab which can help us to get there, right? There have been a lot of promises about the digital lab, right? And as I already mentioned, the progress was moderate at best. So this means when we think about what a digital lab is about, right? It's really how can I run a sample without touching a keyboard or touching a mouse, for example, right? Or how can I eliminate my errors, right? When you think about manual transcriptions are the biggest issue for a lab in terms of error sources, right? The other might be, for example, standard preparation. And we have to understand that, for example, in the course of a quality relevant process, you have to do about 40 manual transcriptions, right? When you look at other statistics, 3 to 5% of every manual transcription is erroneous. And when you do the math, this means that at least per quality relevant process, there is one error. And this is what you have to find out. This is why, for example, it's so cumbersome for the lab managers to sift through all the processes. And I've looked at the lab journals in the laboratories, and it happens that you just have to sum up two numbers and you do a mistake, which is very human, right? And so this is what we have to overcome. And it's not really looking at the gadgets, it's looking at the tangible benefits, right? And I think what is also important is we are talking a lot about digital lab, right? But digital is a user experience. The starting point for this journey would be to digitize your lab operation in a meaningful way, which means to transfer, to convert your paper-based processes into electronic analogs with the appropriate business logic behind.
Well, that actually leads on to what was going to be my next question, which was, what advice would you give to someone if they were starting to look at their lab and thinking, right, we need to go digital now with our lab? So what would be the first steps that you would recommend to a lab manager if they were looking at that?
Yes, so first of all, I would challenge the question, right? I want to go digital. Right. So the real question is, so what do I want to achieve? What is my desired end state?
Sure.
And I think an error-prone and efficient lab is a very good approach, I would think, right? So then the second aspect is, I think we already mentioned that the lab operation is complex. We have to acknowledge this. And so we should not try to boil the ocean, right? I have seen big projects in big pharma companies. They had requirement documents with 600 requirements, and they tried to implement this for 2 years, and then they stopped the project, right? I met some of the stakeholders years later, and I asked, hey, where did your project go? And they said, well, we stopped it. Perhaps we have been a little bit too overambitious, right? So this means that of course, we have to define our end goal, but as I already mentioned, it's a journey, right? As in every journey, you have to take step by step. And what we also have to acknowledge, digitalizing or digitizing a lab is very disruptive for the lab operation. It's the most disruptive thing you can do to a lab, right? Because it changes fundamentally the way you work. So what are reasonable steps? Starting again with the heterogeneity of the lab, wouldn't it be good, for example, to bring all data into one place, right? Because this is what a lab manager has to do at the end, to look at all the data. Here, a tool like a scientific data management comes into the game, which harvests all the data automatically in the lab. A lot of lab managers are even not aware that these kind of tools exist, right? The advantage of this is it gives you a first step, also from the data integrity perspective, and it happens in the background. Right? So no disruption or almost no disruption to the lab operation. And then you think, okay, what are my critical workflows where it makes a lot of sense to start with to digitize them? And so, for example, let's start with a chromatography workflow, right? And then you take a certain milestone, digitize or digitalize this operation. You might iterate a little bit, but then you have already made your experience for the next step. And I think this is also quite important.
Right. But then obviously you're talking about workflows, but who would you expect to be implementing all these workflows? Because as you said, within a lab, there's lots of workflows that people are doing throughout the day.
Yes. And I mean, of course, we do not throw our products over the wall and here you have a manual and go for it, right? So definitely the starting point is that we as a vendors try to map the workflows, right? And I think it's always very important that the product you select as a lab person has really the flexibility from the data model perspective to cope with your terminology, right? Again, every lab is different. And so typically what we as a vendor, we do is that we configure the system due to the terminology in the lab. We implement the first workflows, and then we have a term, we call it give the power to the lab, right? Because we do not want, if a lab, and I say it's a journey with milestones, when you want to go to the next milestones, you call the vendor and you're completely dependent on us, right? This is not what we are striving for. If you want us to do this because you have not the capacity, we are glad to do this, but it's not what we are striving for.
Right, okay. And so in an ideal world, what do you envisage the digital lab of the future to look like?
Well, so again, I think it's not about the gadgets, right? I already mentioned, so what if I can run a sample without touching a mouse or touching a keyboard? When I'm running my process, how can the system help me to avoid any errors? And it's not about really detecting errors in hindsight, but really preventing errors, right?
Sure.
So for example, how can I avoid that I use instruments which are not fit for purpose or an expired standard? Then of course, I already mentioned that the review for the lab manager is very cumbersome, takes a lot of time, is really one of the bottlenecks in the entire lab operation, right? So this means, can the system help me to identify if there is an out of specification result or if there was an error? This is what we call review by exception, right? And of course, collaboration is also very important, right? So for example, especially also in research environments, we are talking a lot to global companies. I want to make my work accessible to other peers. I want to access work and results of the peers in order to avoid redundant work, perhaps via cloud systems. And I think there are more things, but it's all about really the tangible aspects for the people at the bench.
Right, okay. So I have a question for you. Obviously, Agilent, you've got your software and informatics division. Obviously, Thermo have theirs, Waters have theirs, everyone has their Shimadzus and so on.
Yes.
So obviously, there's been a lot of talk about open sourcing software as well, so that it can be used by everybody. So with regards to the software that you provide and do, is it only applicable to Agilent machines, or can you use it with other instruments as well?
So beyond the lab operation being complex, the lab is very heterogeneous, right? And I would love, in a perfect world, everything is Agilent instrumentation, Agilent software, right? But we also have to deal with the reality. And so this means that, of course, Agilent as a solution provider could equip a lab from start to finish with instrumentation, consumable software, and so forth. But we have to deal with whatever is there. Sure. Right? And so this, of course, also applies to different instrumentations. There are a plethora of software systems, a plethora of different instrumentations in the lab, a plethora of data formats, right? And this is all what we have to cope with, and I think what we can cope with.
Right, fantastic. Okay, so I know you ran recently a series of webinars. So what were they about?
Yes, so it's really about some aspects and also possibilities about the digital lab, right? So as we already said, the term digital lab, or especially lab of the future initiatives, are already around for a long time. And I always say, from the perspective of the past, the lab of the future is today, right? And so it's not about waiting for innovation any longer. It's really to start the implementation. And we want to educate our customers, our prospects, how you can get there with the paradigms I already described a little bit. And so I think we are in a unique situation that we have constructed our portfolio in a very sorrowful way that, for example, you can have as a starting point a chromatography data system, right? Every lab has a chromatography data system, but now you want to go digital. And what if I follow Agilent's advice and I want to harvest all the data in my lab, right? An approach that we have taken is, hey, you can harvest all the data already in your chromatography data systems backend, right? And so this means from the implementation perspective, from the IT perspective, this is very desirable. And then you can grow organically, right? So for example, the next step might be, okay, I want to connect my chromatography data system to a LIMS. You can do this, right? Or now I want to start to digitize the workflows, right? And this is how with our portfolio, we can really build these workflows from the second when the sample enters into the lab to the moment where the data has to go into a long-term archive for whatever the retention time is.
Brilliant. Okay. And obviously the webinar will run, but if people want to access them, are they available on demand?
Yes, they are available on demand, definitely. Yes.
Great. So I'll make sure we put the link to those above this video as well, so people can access them. Brilliant. One final question for you. I mean, if you look, obviously, the current situation with COVID, you know, it's a terrible situation. But one thing that has happened because of it is that it has pushed people to use new technology, to open
Yes.
their minds, and to think of how they can be more resourceful and work more remotely.
Mm-hmm.
So have you seen that in terms of your own experiences over the last few months, in terms of people coming and talking to you about digitizing their lab and how you can help them now to actually cope with the new reality that people are working in?
Definitely, definitely. So think about, this is a notebook, right? And you have your lab data in a notebook, and this notebook is lying on your desk in a lab, and you're not allowed to go to the lab. What do you do, right? Luckily, the paradigms we talked about of the digital lab, right? They inherently help you also in this regard, right? And even if you start from the paradigm, okay, I want to make my lab error-free. What does this mean? This means I want to apply a higher degree of automation, right? When I apply a higher degree of automation, I inherently speed up my process. This I do via digitization, right? Digitization means I have my information available in an electronic way, and I perhaps can just use my computer at home or my smartphone to see the status of my lab, what is going on in my lab. Perhaps when I have harvested all my data in a central repository, I can even approve the certificates of analysis from home. So this is actually very tangible, but not only from the day-to-day work. I think it's also important if customers are starting today, how do you deploy such a system, right? And this is something also we looked in, that we can actually deploy such a system completely remotely, right? Within the installation, configuration, and so forth.
Fantastic. Great. So if people want to know more, then there will be links to the webinar above this that you talked about. Plus, I'm sure you've got a website which we can direct people to for more information as well, which again, I'll put the link above here as well.
Absolutely. So you can either go to agilent.com or you just go to Google, enter Agilent SLIMS, right? And you will get a lot of educational material, how you can cover your laboratory operation.
Fantastic. And I'm sure Agilent and your business, you will be at lots of virtual events coming up, no doubt, in the near future.
Absolutely.
Right. So where people can get to talk to you in person, hopefully network virtually, if nothing else. And if you have got any questions, actually, then please put them on the comments below or message Thomas directly. I'm sure you'll be delighted to answer your questions. So Thomas, thank you very much for taking the time out to talk to me about digital labs. It's very interesting. I mean, all these things now are so very, very topical now, given the current situation everybody's in. So I appreciate you taking the time out to talk to me. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you for your time, and thank you for having this discussion.
Fantastic. And as always, as I said, if you've got any questions for Thomas, please leave a comment, go to the website, look out for them at various virtual shows. The links will all be above the video. And until next time, as always, stay well and stay safe. Thanks for your time. Bye-bye.